period of time. How do we cope with those challenges, do you think?
They have to cope with the parapatsy. So all the
and maybe this is just the way I cope with life and decision making, but I feel like if
human being who's trying to cope with death, old girlfriend.
What were some of the healing mechanisms that you used to cope with trauma? What advice would you use?
A peer visiting group brought the How to Cope with Limb Loss. You threw it behind your shoulder.
Fluent. So that's how we cope with linguistic stage fright, with linguistic performance anxiety.
Confident, they cope with this moment totally fine. And then there are other people.
And the cameras could cope with stage lighting levels. One had to go in.
Keynesian economics was an attempt to cope with it, didn't work out.
Couldn't cope with life without, you know, the way things.
To us, and it's the way we cope with it. I know that sounds.
And help you to cope with pain. This system is similar.
Cope with the changes better, and it's the poor who will be.
Culture in many ways and how we cope with what we see. Now,
die, but it can become a way in which they cope with distress or overwhelming negative.
After he said he could no longer cope with some of the material coming.
In the Russian psychology, read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Russians are very tough-minded people who can cope with adversity. So it's worth understanding that as you think about the sanction effect. Absurdistan is
emotions. They may cope with them differently. We are different.
Christmas sales, we cope with all that sort of stuff. It's the length of time which is different, and perhaps the geographical.
And I couldn't cope with the fact that the daughter of the two main characters.
But I'm more able to cope with the everyday realities because the river really showed me that.
Governments are struggling to cope with the aftermath of terror attacks, such as those in France, Belgium, and Denmark, along with
with the government there to help us cope with our fate. It's the exact opposite.
Haven't really learned to cope with failure well, and when something goes off course.
Determine how to cope with regional coalitions that seek to push America out of Eurasia, thereby threatening America.
To help us cope with reality as it is rather than
judging that, but we are trying to help them to develop some healthy ways to cope with what they're feeling.
You had mentioned
time, and they have all kinds of interesting adaptations to cope with that. But what's happening with climate change is the extreme.
For the permafrost thaws at a given site. So we can cope with permafrost and we can cope with non-permafrost, but that transition from permafrost.
A way that's positive.
The way that you fight, the way that any government program you cope with that you don't particularly like is not by fighting.
Scientists does a lot of work helping younger scientists cope with the challenges that they find themselves subject to.
They stop the bullies, but you can teach kids how to cope with that when it's happening. All right? So I want you to think about.
They end up being